I opened up last week and I said if the Lord permitted, I would be here again. So here I am. So if you want to open your books, your Bibles to the book of Jude, the epistle of Jude. If you watched Festival, I treated a little bit of this, the opening verse at least, and specifically one word. So I'd like to kind of, I'm going to try and do translation when it's needed and necessary, and try and do some of the deeper stuff that's a little bit more complex on Festival for those who want to tune in and get a little bit more meat. But out of this, Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ. And I've just put here Jesu Christou, which is the Greek for Jesus Christ, and Doulos, which is the King James puts down servant. And a slave in our modern tongue, in the modern perspective, carries with it horrific, pejorative connotations, all right? There isn't anything pretty about the word. There isn't anything good about the word. But first thing we need to do is we need to look at the word in its proper setting. This is my contention with much of Bible interpretation. Many of the errors and heresies, and they are blatant heresies that have crept into the church, they're heretical because those who are taking this word and not considering the time in which these people were writing. Certainly we know that all the New Testament was complete, save for the book of Revelation. All of the books were complete before the fall of 70 AD, save, as I said, the book of Revelation. And we have to get the mindset, the social structure of society when these people were writing. Now, to do that and to understand the context provides us with a sure foundation. There's nothing worse, as I said, nothing more heretical than people taking something without a social understanding of the times. It is one of my biggest pet peeves, in fact, when I travel around and I hear people teaching on certain concepts out of the Bible. It is a verse taken out of context because it is failure to recognize that social settings and structures have changed and evolved in the case of societies. What is permissible, what is actually done. We are no longer a barter society, for example. We don't barter anymore. I mean, you may barter stuff here and there, but by and large, we're a society of plastic and what remains of paper money. That being said, there's a lot that has changed. So I'm careful to treat the subject and the word that I'm treating in its context first. And the word we were looking at on Festival is the word doulos, which is being translated in your King James, servant. I read out of the Theological Lexicon of the New Testament. So you're not just taking my word for it. I do my homework, but you're not just taking my word for it. This is a 3-volume by Sislak-Spick. I think this is a Hendrickson publication. And the article under doulos, which carries with it several other, we'll call them synonyms at this point. The article starts with, "It is wrong to translate doulos as servant, so obscuring its precise signification in the language of the first century. In the beginning, before it became used for slaves, doulos was an adjective meaning unfree as opposed to free." And one cannot grab hold of the meaning of what will be meant by people writing like Jude and Paul and others using this term and lessening it to servant if A, they do not understand the use by the time the New Testament was being written, the evolution of language For example, there are archaic words we no longer use in English, but go back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, and those were words of the day. Try and use them today, and people say, huh, what you talking about? What? Doesn't make sense. So we have to have that mindset. That's number one. Number two, if we trace the development of a word, desiring to understand its usage, it's imperative for us in context to go back and look at if there are other words, for example, in the Hebrew from the Old Testament, that as 200 to 300 years before Christ, the Septuagint, that is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, was made. How these words appear in the Septuagint, that gives us an understanding of how the word is developing and essentially evolving in its use up until the time of the New Testament. Now, here's what's crucial, because I'm needing to give the background for folks who weren't listening on festival. In 1999, my late husband began teaching out of the book of Romans. And he started his translation. He was a great linguist. He started his translation from the first line, Romans 1:1, Paul, Doulos, King James translating servant, but indeed, he was right to translate it slave if we properly understand the meaning of this word in its setting and how it may affect our understanding and relationship with the Lord, not man to man, but with the Lord. Unfortunately, during that time, there was at least one individual who was so grossly offended. And it's kind of funny because this individual was a prominent friend of Dr. Scott's, was so offended by this translation that he left the church. I find this rather interesting, by the way, because we're not talking about a personal idea that Dr. Scott came up with. There are books upon books, any scholar, any student of the Bible desiring to look. The tools are there. This isn't a mystery. This isn't like, well, I possess the tools and I won't share them with you. I've told you when I was teaching the church here the Hebrew language, I gave you the tools I used. And when I've given you tools for Greek as well. I tell you, look, go search out for yourselves. Go look at it and see for yourself, because that brings a depth that perhaps you're like me, you're a hardhead. You need to see with your own eyes. But this individual left the church so offended by Dr. Scott's translation of slave, unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, but unfortunately, this is the thing that is confirmed. The carnal mind cannot comprehend spiritual things. That's what Paul said, and it's an absolute truism. The carnal mind rejects the spiritual things. If the person has been born from above and the Spirit of God is in them, then the eyes of the Spirit and the ears of it's all functioning, and we're no longer thinking in the carnal way when we go to interpret this book and we go to study it. We're seeing it with different eyes. They're not eyes that say, I don't understand. They're eyes that say, Lord, help me to understand. So it was rather kind of sad because this individual, who also fancied himself somewhat of a scholar, proved the exact opposite. Because what we encounter in this word as we search it out is something remarkable. See, this word servant we're looking at in Jude appears, and as I said, in many of Paul's writings. And Paul wasn't the first to use this word. In fact, if you look to the Hebrew language back there in the Old Testament, you're going to find a word that's quite familiar for this church. Forgive me, I haven't done this in a while. This would be the noun. Sorry for my scribbles here. This would be the noun. And then there is a verbal form which sounds more like abad, different vowel points on it as a verb. But you'll encounter this word early on in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, without realizing that you've encountered it. Hold that thought. I'm going to make you spin pages, so forgive me. Go to Genesis 2. I want to show you so you can see with your own eyes what I'm saying, how important it is to see what happens when we study words. Genesis 2 and verse 5. And here we are in the garden. And the last part of that verse says, "For the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth. There was not a man to till the ground." That word for till is this very word in its verbal form, which if you're curious and you want to look this up after I'm done, please be my guest. If you have a Bible like mine, you'll see the Strong's number right there above the word till is 5647. But you see, it's right there. You'd never guess that that word for to till will carry the connotation of to work, to serve, and not always slave. This is why I said it's important for us to study this concept through the book and understand that there are nuances of things. We know Hebrew is quite ambiguous. If you keep searching this word, you find that just in Genesis alone, there are many ways that the King James will translate this. In 2:5, it's to till the ground. In 2:15, the King James says that the Lord God took the man, put him into the Garden of Eden to dress. There it is again, to dress it and keep it. Somewhat interesting now that you can see one is to till, one is to dress it and keep it. The next time you encounter this word, it's going to be another till. But as we progress, you're going to see something very interesting. This word will develop into several different concepts. To work, at first, it appears simply as to do or perform service or work. Because of the curse of the ground, it will become labor that is needful or necessary, and in many cases will be essentially God imposing this labor upon man with the curse falling on man. So servitude in a strange way, almost in a different light, servitude, slave to the ground. There wasn't a convenient 7-Eleven close by to the Garden of Eden where if you didn't feel like tilling the ground, you could just go to the convenience store, right? You had to work. Now you're a slave. You must work if you want to eat. So you can begin to see the development of that word. Later on, still in the book of Genesis, we'll see the term, these two Hebrew words, ebed and abad, being used out of the mouth of Abraham, where it is not in a pejorative way when he's speaking to God and he says, "Thy servant," speaking of himself, "thy servant, ebed," he's speaking of himself, is a term of reverence and worship. And then later on, as Abram becomes Abraham and begins to accrue much cattle and many things, he has men, servants, and maidservants or handmaids. And these men servants now become what we would call servants or slaves, doing service man to man for man, but not necessarily, again, with a negative connotation like we envision modern slavery. That only becomes true when the Lord speaks to Abraham and says, "You're going to become so numerous and you will, what you have produced, your line, will indeed go into a foreign land, become slaves, servants, slaves in that land, and then be delivered out in the 4th generation." There we begin to see the ugliness of slavery and the term that is embedded there. And it was out of the mouth of God. God could have made it be otherwise, but this was his design. He'd become father of many, generation after generation, and then they would go into Egypt's bondage, and then they would come out. He would deliver them with a deliverer, and they would come out, but they would be slaves in Egypt. This word is transported through and develops. Now, why am I taking you on this journey? Because I'm showing you how we can see at the beginning how this word has different meanings, and as it develops, and we know Hebrew is kind of vague, as it develops, it's taking on several different shades. Now, let me show you something really peculiar. Seeing we're taking this journey for a little brief excursus in the Old Testament, let me show you something really, I think, kind of strange. See what you think. Turn to the book of Exodus. Now, they've been delivered out of Egypt's bondage. Same word we've been looking at, ebed and abad, the verb and the noun form. They've been delivered out of Egypt's bondage. And in Exodus 20, gosh, you guys are going to hate me. In Exodus 20, God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. That you're reading the same Bible as I am, right? Good. All right, in those commandments, I want you to take a look at something kind of important. Verse 9, 6 days shalt thou labor. The labor word right there is ebed, or ebad. And then read down in the 10th verse, 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, 5650, that's your ebed word, manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle. I don't know how you can prevent cattle from working, but okay. Nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. So you can see there's two words being used of this ebed and abad word, right? And you can keep reading and find them everywhere. But here's the weird thing. That wasn't the weird thing. Here's the weird thing. He's just delivered them out of Egypt, okay? Out of Egypt's bondage. Gives them the 10 Commandments. In verse 22, he gives them instruction for making an altar. And that's kind of funny, too, because if you read several translations, he says he doesn't want to have steps that go up to his altar that the individual's nakedness, in other words, that the parts don't hang out because they'd have to be going up the stairs, right? Just saying, God's thinking, do I really want to see this? Never mind. 3 shows daily. All right. Chapter 21. Now, I want you to focus. I'm trying to be light here. This is a heavy subject. But chapter 21, he just delivered them out of Egypt's bondage, gives them the 10 Commandments, tells them to build an altar. And then 21 and verse 2, if thou buy a Hebrew servant. What? He just delivered them out of Egypt's bondage. Why are you going to go buy a Hebrew servant? Wait a minute. These people are free. They're free people. They're free out of Egypt. Why has God given them laws about servants? Ebed. Back to that same word. So it's kind of interesting. You know, if you've ever kind of analyzed this, that God delivers them out of Egypt's bondage, and then once he gives them the law and the altar, then he talks to them about the laws regarding their slaves. If you're going to buy a slave, if you're going to have a slave. Don't, some people write off the Bible and say, oh, yeah, that's simple stuff. No, it's complicated because there are some things being said that are actually, they require New Testament thought process here, which is, first and foremost, although God's giving laws of the customs of the day, there's also kind of we'll call it a silhouette statement being made, which is, even though he's just given them laws to abide by, they're bound, which is what Paul will say in Galatians, essentially as slaves to the law until grace came through Jesus Christ. There's very interesting things that you got to dig out here, but here's the law that God gives order for the Hebrew servant. He says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, which is the same word, slave or servant, 6 years he shall serve. One of them's a verb, one of them's a noun. In the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he should go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master hath given him a wife, and she hath borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's. That means she's going to stay with the master, but the man will go out by himself. If the servant, ha'ebed, shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, I don't want to go, then his master shall bring him unto the judges, Another interesting translation, because that is the same Hebrew word for the Lord, ha-Elohim. I don't know why they do these things. He shall also bring him to the door, unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Now, a couple of interesting things here. The rest of this continues. If you keep reading through, this continues, even though it doesn't appear like it, it continues to be laws regarding what the King James is calling servants. Why this grips my attention is, there's so many reasons why. I've taught on this passage before, but I can't help but think that although God is giving the laws for the right treatment, he's also saying something else, and there's many profound things, that man indeed essentially is a slave to the law until Christ was come, who set us free. As John says, whom the Son sets free is free indeed. But equally that if we understand slavery or servanthood in its proper form, this is indeed a representation of the Christian. For if you follow through, one who is brought into, and we'll call it servitude for right now, but one who says, I love my master and I don't want to go out, the ear being pierced, now some have said it's the ear nailed to the door, some have said simply that the ear is pierced at the door, but I don't care how you want to slice it. The ear is for listening. The ear is for obedience. The ear is one thing. The doorposts play a big role in Exodus. As you remember, they put the blood over the doorpost for the death angel to pass by, as in covered by the blood. That typifying, or if you want to typify the door in the New Testament type is a type of Christ. You've got all these interesting shadows to look at, and it says, and he shall serve him forever. That I always say it's important for us to kind of grab hold of. God's not only telling us about the old way as he's telling us what happened then, but he's also telling us something prefiguring what this will look like before the New Testament comes. Now it's interesting that even for the high priest, where was the blood applied? The ear, the toe. We talk about the walk and the listening, the obedience. I can't help but say that this all comes back to a concept, even to modern day Jewry, where if you read in the King James, it says in verse 6, his master shall bring him to the judges, he shall also bring him to the door and to the doorpost. The doorpost word right there is where you read for the first time what later becomes something affixed to the door in modern Jewry, ha-mezuzah, which in modern Jewry is what they affix to the door, which is a scroll inside a small ornamental box that must be on the proper side of the door, that must be affixed by a rabbi according to their law, that contains usually the Shema or some part of the Shema in it. That is essentially we'll call it in our terms, in Christian terms, a benediction or a blessing as you come and go into that home. The first time you encounter this word, simply the doorpost and the hearing essentially are tied together. So I'm giving you this idea that when we're pressing towards looking at the New Testament meaning, we've got to consider all of these words that encompass and give color to the word ebed and abad, which we're getting our word doulos. Now, as you travel through the book, you find out that this word, doulos, as you come into the Septuagint, 200 to 300 years before the New Testament, the occurrences are approximately 300 in the Septuagint of doulos. There are other words, we'll call them synonyms. Sometimes the word pais, Greek P-A-I-S, which we also get words that develop like paideia, but pais, or house servant. The other words are oiketes, that is more like a house steward. But these are all words that develop as you navigate through the book. what's interesting is that by the time you get into the New Testament, you're forced to do two things: to recognize that the essential pejorative meaning that it carried with it in earlier times is now fading away. And when it is used, it must be understood, again, in proper social context. We know that in Asia Minor and throughout that part of the known world, slavery was an actuality. Roman slavery, Greeks, everybody had slaves. So I don't know why we kind of coil back and say, well, that's terrible. That was the culture of the day. However, the writers of the New Testament are using this word when we are reading in context of themselves in a different light. Now, this is where I have to give some elaboration before I can even get into my message. What is happening here is, yes, there are times you're going to read in the New Testament where an individual is actually someone's slave. The word itself, by the way, doulos, you cannot escape the meaning that is subject to another's will or carrying out the service or will of another. Most of the time, the bulk of the use in the New Testament is not involuntary. And there, if you have a Bible like mine and you look up some of these words, you're going to find, especially in the Zodiades, they say doulos is meaning most of the time that these individuals involuntarily coerced into. Now, that's not verbatim the definition, but they're essentially insinuating that. And I have to wholeheartedly disagree with that. The opening of Jude's letter, Jude, lest you forgot that I'm actually trying to take us through Jude, Jude, the servant, the doulos of Jesu Christu. Jesu Christu doulos, that's how it reads in the Greek. And what does this exactly mean? So this is why it's important to pick apart these word meanings and make sure that we rightly understand them. Because when we rightly do, I'm telling you what happened to me is as I studied these words, it really actually was a blessing to me. It brought something to not only my eyes in reading the Greek and translating, but it brought something to my heart as I was sitting on festival talking about this subject that I thought was, for me, unparalleled. And not that it's complicated, it's quite simple. If we're going to go back to the dictionary, let me just read here. To be a slave is to be attached to a master. Now, I ask you a question. Jude speaks of himself as a doulos. Paul speaks of himself as a doulos. Peter speaks of himself as doulos. Paul speaks of Epaphras and Timothy as doulos. These are men indeed serving the Lord. But there's another Greek word for serving, diakonos. They're not necessarily diakonos. These are being referred to as doulos. And as I taught the other night, this is being attached to a master, a link of subjection. And the wonderful thing is, in this case, article of personal property, it must be understood in this light when referencing Christ. When we say Christ redeemed us. And I've taught on this word many, many years ago, ex agorazo. He took us off the market of the world, the flesh, the devil. He bought us. When you buy something, it's yours. Usually when you buy something, it's yours, right? You buy it, it's yours. I also say if you break it, it's yours too, right? Now, I know that Paul makes this so clear for us. Let's just read his words because I think they bring such extreme clarity. Better to take it straight out of the Bible than for me to try and wobble through this. A few things here. He talks about being bought with a price. I'm in 1 Corinthians 7. And the context of 7 is concerning marriage and relations between a man and a woman. But then verses 21 through 24, he says, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. Here he's referring to servitude, man of a man, man serving another man. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. So you see how Paul's looking at this. You are bought with a price. Be ye not servants of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. So what he's saying is, when we read this, we've quoted this many times, you're bought with a price. Bought means somebody cared enough, to buy you out of the dregs of life into the bank of eternity. And that is Jesus Christ, through his shed blood, through his death at Calvary and his resurrection. So when we talk about this, the concept of doulos for Paul and doulos for, even James calls himself a doulos. All right, pay attention. But in the case of all of these individuals, they're saying, I belong to, I identify with, and I belong to. They're not saying this in some false humility. By the way, Jude, his name was quite common. Jude is the Greek version of his Hebrew name, which would have been Judah. That's interesting. Half-brother to Jesus, or brother of James, calling himself a doulos. And why am I telling you this? Because that concept raises a big question. People might say, well, these individuals, they are doulos because these are all the biggies in the book, right? All these main names that we all come to know. But the fact of the matter is that there is that which they refer to themselves as, which we should do, in the fact that we're not our own, we're bought with a price. People that claim to be Christians and then say, well, I'll just go out and just keep doing what I want, which is the definition of sin. Sin is not an individual, I drink, I smoke, I cuss, but sin is doing the track you were on, instead of turning and following the Lord's will. You just keep pressing on in your own way. That's the definition of sin, and falling short, Romans 3:23, which all fall short of the glory of God. But the important thing here is that when we talk about this word being slave to the Lord, it also should bring up for each and every person that I belong to him. Now, out of that word group, Paul very cleverly uses this doulos grouping to help us understand we can be slaves to sin, or we can be slaves to righteousness. And he says, to whom ye yield your members, this is the one you're going to be serving. Now, before I even move on to talk about Jude, I want to press one last concept of this doulos word and its grouping out of Romans 6. Because there you really see the word jump alive, although the King James kind of covers it up a lot. In my wonderful Greek Testament, I've got all the words color-coded. And no, there's only one of these, sorry. Just, in case I want one of those, you can't have it. All right. The 6th chapter of Romans, this will give you an idea. This whole chapter is peppered with doulos, douloi, edoulothete, doula, douloi. It's repetitive. So starting, let's see here where we are. Looks like about the 6th verse. knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve. There's your first verb in the doulos family, doulien, sin. And this is important. I wish I would have done this when I taught through Romans. Being a slave to something. Now think about this for a minute, because we know it's so easy. You don't have to think about forming negative habits, right? They just happen, right? Like let's just say, think of something that is really easy to happen, like decadent chocolate ice cream, double chocolate Rocky Road ice cream that's in your freezer somehow, right? That didn't take much for that to happen there. But, 3 or 4 pints in, right? Negative habits have formed. Wow, this is good stuff, right? And then suddenly you just keep thinking about the next time you're going to have double chocolate Rocky Road, whatever it is that's in your. I'm giving an example to be ludicrous. It's not really like that. But the idea is you become a slave to an appetite. That happens, where you can't stop eating a certain food and you're a slave to it. Some people are slave to a cigarette. But we're not talking about individual small things. We're talking about the concept of sin in the big picture. I'm being ludicrous to drive home these little points where you go, yeah, you're right. Negative habits happen. Forming good habits actually take a little thought, right? And usually a lot of work. So, but you get the idea here of serve sin. It's not like, okay, number 10 is being served, right? It's the doulos, but it's a verb. For he that is dead is freed from sin. And now you can see a play on the words here of being in slave or bondage to something versus being free. Now, if we be dead with Christ, we believe that we also shall live with him, knowing that Christ, being raised from the dead, dieth no more, death hath no more dominion over him. For in that he died unto sin once, but he that liveth, he liveth unto God. Likewise, reckon ye yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, the next time you're going to encounter one of these doulos words is going to be in the 15th verse. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? God forbid. 16, Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants, there it is, doulos. To whom ye yield yourselves, this particular, I think this is the revised in here, English Interlinear New Testament, but I believe this is the revised version in here. They didn't hesitate to put down under doulos slaves as the translation. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves slaves to obey? Remember, the ear was important back there in Exodus when I read and said about the door and the piercing of the ear. To whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, doulos, his servants, there it is again, that same word, douloi, plural, ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. This whole chapter is peppered with this. But God be thanked that you were slaves of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto you. There again, the word appears in verse 17. And then on again in verse 18. Being then made free from sin, ye became, here we have the word again, edulosete. You were enslaved to righteousness. And by the way, that is in the passive, which means an act that happened to you by God's grace. We call that prevenient grace, where the eyes are open and it's not an act of trying like some will worship or some works. Something that happens in the form, what's in your heart. Hearing, he says, of that form of doctrine, hearing it, and something is activated. It doesn't mean, as some have said, that once you hear the words, you sin no more. We sin all the day long. You're still in the blueprint body. You haven't exchanged the body or the brain for a new one. You're still you're still wearing the Adam clothing. And until that great day when this clothing is transformed into the glorious one that he's promised, that is blemish-free and sin-free, I still, and you still, are sinning. And our thoughts are even that way. Our mind is that way. You keep reading. He says, I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. He just said in one verse what took me 5 minutes to say. For as ye have yielded your members servants, there it is again, to uncleanness, and to iniquity, unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants, there's the word again, to righteousness, unto holiness. For when you were the servants of sin, verse 20, let me look right down here. He says, douloi, when you were the douloi of sin, ye were free from righteousness. What fruit had ye then in those things whereof now ye are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. But now being made free from sin and become servants to God. And I love the fact that I don't have to do anything but read this to you, because he says servants, essentially the same word is being carried through and through, douloethentes, having been enslaved to God. Now that's not involuntary. And that can never be involuntary. That's why I said Zodiades translates the doulos, one of the doulos words, and says most of the time it is involuntary. God's not going to do something to you against your will. He's not going to take you and say, now you're mine, and he may keep trying until he says, foot, go board that ship to Tarshish. I'm done, right? But I'm just saying God's not going to force the matter here. So when we look at this word, it's important to realize that these men writing, as they open their epistles and their writing, calling themselves doulos, they had the idea of probably 2 or 3 things coming up. One is bought with a price, and I, essentially speaking like Paul or like Jude or any of these, including what Paul was referring to in Romans 6, which refers to you and to me, we belong to him. We are his. Now I know, that's not a novel concept, because that should be preached everywhere. You belong to him. You are his. But when you really stop to kind of think about it and you process the word, no, not just Paul or Timothy or Jude, doulos, but you as well. You belong to him. It should add some depth, even though it's a concept you know. But you read it from here and you think, yeah, I am his. I am his possession. I used to sing a song, I long to be his possession. Oh, he is my everything. Well, we need to change the words to that song, because although I long to be his possession, by faith I am. I don't have to long for it. He said he did this thing, and as long as I'm faithing, he says, I don't care if you're the worst rat in the world, you look to me and be saved. And that's the type of thing that every single person in the sound of my voice should be saying, I rejoice no matter what. It doesn't, like Paul, it says just because grace is there, it doesn't mean I should just keep on going in the path that I was in. But he cares about me because I'm his. I could take this message and take you to the potter's house and put new, fresh application, because the message of God, the potter, working on the clay, and that's you. But you are his workmanship. You are his work of art. He's working on you. So when you walk around saying, I just don't know what's going on, and I can't figure out anything, and this is all a mess, sit down for just 2 minutes and say, I'm his. I belong to him. So the first thing I've got to do is I got to talk to my master. I got to tell him. He knows. But if I really believe in my heart, this is the definition between believing and faithing, but I use the word belief, so forgive me. But if I really faith that I am his possession, then I better sit down and talk to my master versus trying to figure out how to solve the problem. You buy something that is defective. Do you try and fix it, or do you go to the manual, you call the maker, you go to the, usually you've looked at the manual, and the manual doesn't help you any, so usually you have to take it back. You've got to talk to the manufacturer. You've got to go back to the source. We have to go back to the source. That's 99% of the problem with Christendom today, is no one cares about going back to the source, because the reality is to say that you belong to somebody else and that you can't on your own, well, that's a contradiction of today's preaching. But Christ said, without me you can do nothing. And I guess if you want to be a Christian, and forgive me for saying it that way, but if you want to follow Christ, that must be ringing in your ears. Without me, Christ's words, without me you can do nothing. But with me, with him, with God, all things are possible. Therefore, using this word in its right context, with the proper meaning, says, he owns me. And you know what? I think about the years of my life as a Christian. And I've been through some pretty rough stuff. I know my Master loves me. My Lord loves me. There's no doubt. He loves this church. He loves his church. So, when you start reading these words, and they've been glossed over, and there are people who they're offended. They're offended to even hear the word in its proper context. With today's climate, where everybody is so quick to jump on a bandwagon about some word, and most people don't even have a clue of tracing the etymology or the development of an expression. Like this person used an expression commentating on something, and everybody jumps on this person and says, "Oh, did you hear what they just said?" Oh. Meanwhile, social media is just laced with explicatives, and no one's going, "Oh." This is the demented state we live in. That's why I said to just peel this back and recognize, for those who call themselves Christians and understand what I'm talking about, it's quite glorious to say, I belong to him. And as Jude was writing to what I've called the Acts of the Apostates, because he's going to go on to talk about things in his day that are still going on today. This is why we don't need new books being created about this and about that, because here the Bible speaks to us in this day and age of people who have abandoned the faith, who have twisted the word, who have made serving God into a business. We'll keep studying it, and you'll see pretty quick that there's a lot of things in here, nothing's changed. The one thing that is wonderful is when we lift these words out of Jude 1:1, we see that even a person who we don't really know too much about, unlike Paul, where we've got pretty much, we know his tribe, and we know his conversion, and we know the churches. We don't know too much about Jude. The only thing we know is what he states. He says he's a doulos of Jesu Christo, of Jesus Christ. We know he is brother to James, therefore half-brother to the Lord, out of 4 brothers of the Lord. We know that. We don't know to whom this was addressed, but we've got a pretty good indication he was probably writing to Jewish converts based on the information embedded in that small 25-verse epistle. But he calls himself, he doesn't call himself apostolos, apostle, but he does call himself doulos. And I don't think the term was self-abasing, as in, oh yeah, I really dread, and it's kind of like, oh God, I really dread doing this slave thing for God, but I'm going to do it because I got to do it because no one else is going to do it. I don't think that was the meaning right there. I think he's saying, my master bought me, and with joy, with a gracious heart, with understanding of what has happened here, the actual Messiah. I mean, think about it. His brothers and his mother wanted to put him away. They wanted to put Jesus away because they thought he was nutty. Remember when they said to him, look, your family's here. And he said, who is my mother and who are my brethren? But those that do the will of the Father. Again, there's that ear thing. Listen up. So what I'm saying to you is, as I begin to peel back what I'd call important words out of this small epistle, this is one that applies to you and to me. This isn't a term where we translate and we just say, and this is what it reads for the book of Jude. No, this is what it reads in the book that represents the book of life, recorded in heaven for you and for me. Those that can say, I'm his, I belong to him. And I think once that becomes a reality, I think a lot of times we walk around, and the beginning is kind of an exercise of, okay, I'm believing this, okay, I'll start faithing this, I'm going to start trusting, I'm going to start leaning. But when it becomes a reality, I'm his. The peace that comes, that passes all understanding of why you're here. One time I was telling you about we have a purpose. You're not just here as an accident. The things that you go through, although they are unpleasant, not all of them are of God or of the devil. Some things that happen, you just can't explain it. You say, I'm his. My master knows all about me. And just as surely as I'm talking to you about Jude and about Paul, the term servant of God is through eternity, age old. As it says, Abraham was a servant of God, and Isaac was a servant of God, and Jacob, who became Israel, was a servant of God. The Psalms talk about David, the king of Israel, as the Lord speaking in one of the Psalms, saying, David, my servant. Same words being uttered. I can't fathom that God meant that in such a negative way, but what a glorious thing to say, I'm his. And from an unknown, we'll call it rather a known person in this book, I'm referring to Jude, pretty wonderful that although maybe he wasn't called to be an apostle, maybe he wasn't called to be an evangelist, but the first thing we can know about him is he says, I'm a doulos of Christ. I belong to him. I was bought. I belong. I'm not wandering around. I have a purpose. There's a reason of why I'm here. Paul addresses the same thing in Romans 6, which I just read to you, when he says of these, but now being made free from sin, become servants of God, douloi of God. Ye have your fruit unto holiness, and the end everlasting life. I can't think of anything greater that we could walk around and instead of looking at that word and saying, oh, that carries negative connotation. Well, to the carnal mind or to those looking simply at world and secular history, yes. But to those of us reading with the eyes of the Spirit in this book, what a glorious statement for every single individual. It means to the person who's listening to me who says, well, I don't really feel like I belong. I feel like I might be one that he forgot about. No, trust me, he knows who are his. And although there are so many, I don't even know how God keeps track. He does. He hasn't forgotten about you. You are his possession. You don't have to say, oh, Lord, please make me one of yours. Just the fact that you even sit down and talk to him or want to read this book says you identify with him, and by faith, just for that, nothing else, you're his. So I just lifted out one word, made a whole message about one word to tell you what a glorious thing for us. It's not something offensive. It's not something negative. It's a wonderful thing. It makes all of the problems that will happen in your life, all of the good things, all of the joyous things, all of the mysterious things, somehow make you go back and say, wait a minute, before I start toying with and tinkering with how to try and fix the problem, I'm going to talk to the maker, the one who made it all. I'm going to go back to the source, and I'm going to talk to my master and maker. And I'm going to sit down, and maybe I won't get an answer, but I'm at least going to address it because he knows. He's got it all under control, just like the apostate church in Jude's day, just like the church that has been derailed slightly in our day. You know, Paul writes in Thessalonians, and he says, in the last days, you know, people are going to be believing all kinds of different things. And he says, he's writing, he's saying both to both Timothy and Thessalonians, he says, don't be taken by these things. But he also gives a caution. He says, there's going to be a time when a spirit will come, which will be not a spirit of God, but essentially the spirit of Antichrist, which he says is already at work. And people will look at this individual who is saying great things, and they will be deceived. He says even the very elect will be deceived. Some are already deceived, turned over, they believe a lie and are damned. And these are people who it's so light to them. They hold on to everything so lightly, it doesn't matter. But I'm telling you, if you just can cling to one word, and it's a word that, as I said, to our modern hearing, brings just absolute shivers when you say the word slave. But to these men, and I'm sorry, the King James did a great disservice in its day trying to translate in for its time, using servant. No, the word should be rightly translated, carrying with it the depth of meaning of he owns me. Servant means I can come and go at any time. I can serve tables. I can serve when I play tennis. But when you are a slave, you are either a slave, you are a slave voluntarily, or you are a slave involuntarily. Most of us spend most of our lifetime being involuntary slaves to things that do not carry the profit or the goodness or the grace of God. They just carry with it destruction. Verses like Paul says, to whom ye yield your members. Now, I'm not here to make an altar call. That should have happened while I was speaking, but I am here to tell you the wonderful thing to those people who can say, I'm his. He knows all about my problems. He knows all about my mess-ups. He knows my failures. He knows my frailties. He knows the ups and downs. He's my maker and my master, and he's not going to bail out on me just because life looks a little tough. To Jude in his day, to me and you in our day. We have somebody who cares about us. Why? Because we are his, we belong to him. That's something that should make every single person say, that makes me happy. Just hearing the words, I belong to him. I don't want to belong to somebody in the sense of this way, side to side, unless you're husband and wife. I won't look over there at Barbara and George. But in the greater meaning, not the institution of marriage is wonderful, but in the greater, I remember my husband used to say marriage is slavery and insanity. Do you remember he used to say that? Slavery and insanity. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm going to leave that one alone. But I am going to say that the goodness of God to be able to reach in and grab these words and carry them with us to say, no matter what, I'm his, and you're his. You belong to him. That gives me an even greater sense to say I can make it through. I can make it through the problems of today. And tomorrow, when things seem to fall apart, I know to sit down and talk to my master and maker. He'll work things out. He always does. That's my message. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.